Hello, hello. It's the Japan Zoominar from UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm Ulrike Schede, professor here at GPS and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology. Today is February 24th in San Diego, which makes it February 25th, 2026 in Japan. Ohayo gozaimasu in Japan, and good afternoon, good evening here in the United States. My guest today is Salman, and we're going to talk about Japan's drink industry. And with that, we mean mostly the alcoholic beverages, actually, but we might also cover why Kirin and others sell things that are not whiskey, beer, sake, or shochu. While people are still finding their seats, let me tell you a little bit about us. This finds you as at GPS, the School of Global Policy and Strategy. We are an international relations and public policy school, and we have over 40 faculty and offer 8 degrees, one of which is a Master's of International Affairs with a Japan specialization. If you're interested in our offerings, please check us out at jfit.ucsd.edu. jfit is our Japan Center. We do a lot of fun things. We're hoping to connect San Diego and Southern California with Japan, and do that through a number of activities, including, of course, most importantly, the JZ, the Japan Zoominar. Our events are recorded. What that means is that we won't see you on the screen. You are invited to please type any questions you might have into the Q&A box. I will not refer to you by your last name unless you type in that you would like to be identified. On the wonderful side of news, we have a JZ gallery, which is our archive of recordings, which you can find at jfit.ucsd.edu/Zoominar or on our YouTube channel. Alrighty, and with that, let me just, before we go to Mac, point out that the next event is in March. We'll have Jim Ramo, who's a professor of sociology at Princeton, talk about demographic change, but not of the aging or shrinking society, but in fact, the family demographics and family dynamics of Japan. And coming up, we'll have a number of interesting, I think, topics, including private equity, innovation, and Japanese history, and other such things. So please join us. All right, and with that, let me stop the share and introduce our guest today. Here he is, Max Salman. Good morning in Tokyo.
Ohayo gozaimasu. Good morning from the world's greatest metropolis, Tokyo, on a rainy day, but nonetheless, we're going to have a very, hopefully, sunny conversation. It's a real honor to be here, Ulrike, amongst all of these illustrious guests that you've had and you will have. I'm very excited for some of the topics coming up. As a former actuary, the demographic crisis in Japan is of true fascination to me. So those conversations are going to be very interesting.
Thank you. So let me introduce you before we kind of jump into our conversation. You hail from the UK, and in a former life, maybe, I don't know, maybe still alive, you were an analyst, and are an analyst and a commentator on not only the Japanese economy, but also culture and art. You've lived in Tokyo for 2 decades. And most importantly, and we'll talk a little bit about this, Mac is the founder and guide of not only Maction Planet, which does bespoke Japan tours, but also Kanpai Planet, which is a YouTube platform and also has an Instagram site. I just looked at the Instagram site. It's a lot of fun. Mac is a certified sake professional. You've got to love Japan. There's a certificate for everything. So in your case, it's the WSET or WSET level 3. That sounds like a really high level. And as you just said, you're an actuary. I think we would call that a CPA in this country or something like that. Not quite. All right. We'll learn what it is. And a diehard fan of the Yakult Swallows and the Exeter City FC. No hat from Exeter? Okay. All right. So Mac, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind introduction. Yes, I've been living in Japan for just short of 20 years now. The 4th of August, 2026 will be the official 20-year anniversary of me moving here. I first came to Japan in 2002 for the World Cup. And really, Of course, I like Japan, but really I love Tokyo. The reason I live in this country is because of this city, which, as I said earlier on, is truly the world's greatest metropolis. And I was working in the UK at the time, and I was able to engineer a move, starting a new job in Japan in 2006. I was in finance, either in insurance or investment banking for the first decade. And then I started my own travel business, Maction, which has grown over the last 9 years. That also recently celebrated its 9th anniversary. And then during the pandemic, various forces conspire to see me release a video reviewing the Foo Fighters sake. So would you believe the American rock band, the Foo Fighters, collaborated with a Japanese sake brewery, Tatenokawa, to release a sake. I decided to review that and put it not on the Maction YouTube channel, but on its own platform, Kanpai Planet, which has now grown to just under 9,000 YouTube subscribers, and a few fun other projects as well. That also just celebrated its 5th anniversary, and we released a sort of feature-length documentary kind of showcasing the first 5 years. So if anybody is interested in learning more about that, then please go and check that out.
Wonderful, thank you. So, there's so much going on in the Japanese drink industry, from whiskey and the large icons and the beer guys to the smaller, well, there are actually some big sake guys, but also smaller sake people, and so companies. So let's start with the big guys. Let's go, the global icons. So we have these 4 big beer companies, and then they all kind of have been into whiskey, Suntory being the biggest of those, I think. And then Kirin kind of echoed that, I guess. And then Asahi came and was almost bankrupt in the late 80s. It became Kirin's biggest challengers. So which of these should we start with? Should we start with the whiskey maybe, or the beer?
Yeah, it's definitely we've got I'm sure we've got a solid crowd behind the scenes. So this is one that is going to be jumping around, the timelines, Marvel multiverse style, because you've got obviously all these players are involved in, all of these different verticals. As well as a few areas in which they do differ, and then the stories zigzag around the timelines as well. So why don't we take them kind of one by one? Should we start with Suntory? I mean, that's the one, I think, certainly from the spirit side now and the whiskey side, that's the one that people have heard of.
And Bill Murray in Lost in Translation. This wonderful scene where, for those of you who don't recall, so Lost in Translation, I think, is like also now 20 years ago or so. And so this is this somewhat washed up actor who goes to Tokyo to do a commercial for Suntory whiskey. And there's a scene that you can actually YouTube. You can just say, for relaxed time, make it Suntory time, something. And the Japanese director tells him, in Japanese, and says a lot of things, and the translator says, more intensity.
Yeah. So, and then he says, is that all you just said?
And the answer is, yeah, that's true. That's all he said, actually.
It's so funny because you think these things are cliches. And then, when I first moved to Japan, I didn't speak any Japanese. So I would have a translator in a lot of the meetings I had with companies when I was an analyst. And that happened to me so many times. The IR representative would talk for 5 minutes and my translator would talk for 20 seconds. And I'd just be very confused about what information I clearly was not getting, or that was, dare I say it, lost in translation. But fun fact for you. So the director of that movie, Sofia Coppola, her father, the world famous director Francis Ford Coppola, used to come to Japan, and he actually filmed some commercials for Suntory, one of them with Akira Kurosawa. So that whole thing was a kind of homage and Sophia drawing on her real life experiences.
And of course, Coppola has a winery.
Yes, and Coppola has a winery that has
used to have a winery.
Yes, yeah. Well, he's unfortunately had to let go of it due to I think some financial difficulties with one of his latest movies. But So yes,
So
of course,
Suntory.
Bill Murray, helped back in the early 2000s, put Suntory and the word Suntory, into the global zeitgeist. And they continued through, in 2004 with the acquisition of Jim Beam and the associated companies around that to create a conglomerate called Beam Suntory, which is the third largest spirits group by volume in the world. And then in 2024, 10 years later, they renamed Beam Suntory to Suntory Global Spirits. So what at the time was reported, I mean, it was definitely an acquisition. Suntory paid $16 billion, which I think is still the largest overseas acquisition by a Japanese company in corporate history. But it was reported, an acquisition, but sort of a merger of some equals. But I think the renaming definitely tells you who's in top on that one. So yeah, Suntory, the biggest player on the whiskey side. People are familiar with their famous brands Yamazaki, which was the first specialist whiskey distillery founded in Japan. I mean, distillation started in 1924, but the official date of starting is 1923. That's when they broke ground on the project. So the 100th anniversary of Japanese whiskey was celebrated in 2023. They also have two other distilleries. Hakshu makes a malt and actually a little bit of grain whiskey as well. And then Cheetah makes grain whiskey. And components of whiskey from all three of those distilleries end up in possibly the most famous single brand of whiskey in Japan, which is Hibiki. And that was actually the whiskey that Bill Murray was shilling in Lost in Translation. It was Hibiki 17, which, due to supply shortages, actually kind of went off the shelves in the late 2010s. And then right now, I think some of the interesting things in terms of, talking points around Suntory right now, they've actually just paused production at Jim Beam, and they've restructured their distilleries, which they own on the famous Scottish island of Islay, which is famous for its peated whiskey. And of course, they recently had a change in leadership with Ninami-san, their CEO, stepping away, and Tori, the great grandson of Shinjiro Tori, the founder, stepping in as to take control of the company, bringing the company, back under full family control.
So we still don't know what that story about Ninami-san's resignation was, but is Suntory struggling? I mean, is there a reason why the family wanted it back, or are they unhappy about the Beam acquisition, or what is there a background story there?
I think unfortunately what's happening right now is you're seeing a lot of pressures on the alcohol industry globally. So there's a lot of theories as to what's going on, but there's some data that shows that perhaps Gen Z is drinking a little bit less than previous generations, although still indulging in clearly psychotropic substances are not a problem for them. You've also got a general, I mean, I always refer to it as this kind of neo-prohibitionist movement, which seems to be coming out of the US. And a lot of other, lifestyle trends which are impacting alcohol consumption. We're also in an economic downturn. I mean, if you look at the pricing of some of these bottles, this is perhaps not an example that will affect many of the audience here, although if it does, well done on assembling the fortune which is required to participate in what I'm about to say, which is that, for example, Suntory released a bottle of Yamazaki 25, which has been exclusively aged in Mizunara casks. And they sold that recently with an MSRP in the US of $7,500. That's actually something to touch on a little bit. There's a big disconnect in kind of the way that they're perceived internationally versus domestically. So domestically, obviously, we have a lot of whiskey nerds. Last week, I was at the Chichibu Whiskey Matsuri with my fellow sake otaku, whiskey otaku. And, domestically, if I look at my friend group, they're much more concerned about pricing rather than provenance, right? So they're more interested in a cheap highball, and Suntory have that market fairly well cornered with their Kakabin product. But then overseas, they brand themselves as the House of Suntory, and they very much play on, Japanese craftsmanship. They use words like sukuri wake, and mono no aware, and a lot of other Japanese concepts to try to put their whiskey making in this kind of continuum of Japanese heritage, which, I kind of have mixed views on that strategy. But it's certainly an interesting dynamic.
So you can see it here. And I actually thought there was this, we clearly have the matcha craze right now. And everybody who's been to Japan comes back with matcha and, you bring matcha and so forth. And I thought we also saw a little bit of that in the whiskeys that even at the local supermarket here, what's popular, which is the stuff that they lock up. And certainly there's some of the Japanese whiskeys are the top of the shelf there. And
Yeah,
so
they are.
there is a certain branding around because right now the US is in this Japan, everything Japan is great, right? So I thought it had something to do with that.
You're completely right. I actually made a video about this, called, how Japanese whiskey conquered the world, looking at the rise of Japanese whiskey over the last 25 years. There were so many factors I wanted to bring into that. But one of the ones that isn't really talked about so much is exactly what you've said, Ulrika, the rise of Japan's soft cultural power, which we've seen play out over the last 15 years. That also ties into the tourism boom that's taken place in Japan, where last year we welcomed over 47 million visitors to the country, up from, single digits back 20 years ago, even as late as 2011. So it's an incredible transformation. And all of that is playing into, for example, the whiskey boom that you mentioned. One thing I do want to highlight to people, and I've produced a lot of material about this as well, is unfortunately, there are a number of unscrupulous producers who trade on that Japan brand. So these bottles that you see locked up in your local liquor store, Ulrika, they may look like they're made in Japan. They may have kanji on the label. They may have pictures of Mount Fuji or a samurai, or some of these bottles look like somebody swallowed a ton of Japanese iconography and then vomited it onto some paper. But they are not real Japanese whiskey. They are almost certainly Scotch or Canadian whiskey that's been imported into Japan, bottled here with a nice label, and then exported back out to the US and other countries.
How do I know?
That is one of the problems that the industries face. In February 2021, a group of producers known as the JSLMA, the Japan Spirits and Liqueur Makers Association, basically companies who make, Western alcohol as opposed to, for example, shochu, which is, Japan's indigenous spirit. And this consortium contains over 70 members, but these moves were really led by Suntory, Nikka, who are owned by Asahi, Kirin, who also make whiskey, Chichibu, who are the largest of the craft distillers, and Mars. So that's the big five of Japanese whiskey. And in an attempt, so much pressure had been put on them, really primarily from overseas, of exactly what I've just highlighted. How do we know the provenance of these bottles that we're buying? So they actually came up with new guidelines. But as it later transpired, these guidelines had so many holes in, it's still possible to release whatever you want and face no penalty. And speaking of penalty, the alcohol laws in Japan are determined not by the government per se, but by the NTA, the National Tax Agency. And all they really care about is collecting their revenue. When we go on to touch on the sake industry, for example, nothing would make them happier than a lot of these smaller breweries going bankrupt, because they can just go and collect their revenue from a much more consolidated pot. So last year, we did see some accelerated moves. The word Japanese whiskey was kind of mentioned in Parliament for the first time. The JSLMA has adopted a suggestion which me and some other commentators have been talking about for 5 years now, which is just have a sticker. That's all it needs to say. This is real Japanese whiskey. Stick it on the bottles, like certain countries have a tax sticker. Just put it on.
Japan used to have that. On the cameras, the pass sticker from the quality control. There was
Yeah,
this little golden label. Yeah, 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 yeah.
exactly.
So,
Exactly. So
so I'm not a whiskey drinker, but I think we have a first audience question, and so I like this question very much, which is, what's Japanese about Japanese whiskey? I mean, we know where whiskey originated from. And we also know that there are certain things where Japan is just they took some technology from abroad, brought it to Japan, wakon yosai or whatever, and made it better along some dimension. So for the whiskey experts, how
yes.
is Japanese whiskey really, and how is it different from UK whiskey?
That is an excellent question. Thank you to uh, the person who asked that question, because it's an excellent question. I've touched on this in a couple of videos I've made. I made a series called Three Japanese Whiskey Myths Busted. And one of them was the myth that Japanese whiskey is better. I don't like it. You would have thought I would be heavily invested in attempting to push that kind of mythology, but I'm not a producer. I'm not on the take from any of these companies. So I like to tell it how it is. Japanese whiskey has its origins in the Scotch tradition, and the story of that is absolutely incredible. Many Japanese people know it because NHK made an asadora, a morning drama from 2014 to 2015, 6 months, called Masan, which was the story of Masataka Taketsuru. Now, Masataka Taketsuru in 1918 went across America to Scotland. He did a course at the University of Glasgow. He apprenticed at 3 Scotch whisky distilleries, and he came back with a notebook, which really to this day is the Bible of whisky production, in Japan. And so very, very much, he wanted to make, Scotch essentially, but within the nation state of Japan. That was actually this will tie in when we start talking about Asahi Ulrike, because he became the first distillery manager of Yamazaki. So he's working with Shinjiro Tori, the guy who founded the company now called Suntory. That's the money man. You've got the brains of the operation. And they released their first whiskey in 1923, which by all accounts was smoky whiskey, again, in kind of the Scotch tradition. That's what Taketsuru wanted to make. He disagreed with the location of the Yamazaki distillery from the start. He wanted to put it in Hokkaido, and Hokkaido is the closest place that we have in Japan to Scotland. But the money man, Tori, wanted it, on the train route between the 2 biggest cities in Japan, Tokyo and Osaka. And eventually it's located, in between Kyoto and Osaka on the confluence of 3 rivers. So Taketsuru eventually ended up leaving Suntory. If you speak to the Suntory guys, he was fired. If you speak to the Asahi guys and the Nikka guys, he left of his own volition. However it happened, he very quickly found funding, and he set up the Yoichi distillery up in 1934 in Hokkaido. So that's all worth knowing, because it tells you that absolutely Japanese whiskey is made in the Scotch tradition. However, things have evolved over the last 100 years. One of the ways that Japanese whiskey is quite unique is, until very, very recently, you see that animosity that is there between Suntory and Nikka. It meant that they didn't do something which they do in Scotland, which is swap stocks between distilleries to create blends. So these companies are kind of much more vertically aligned than a lot of Scottish distilleries, meaning that, when Suntory decided that they wanted, more variety in their whiskey making, they had to set up 2 more distilleries, Hakshu and Chita, in the early 70s. When Taketsuru decided he wanted more variety in his whiskey making, he had to set up a new distillery, and that was Miyagi-Kyo in 1969. Now, finally, some of that animosity is worn off. As around the 100th anniversary, we've seen companies starting to swap stocks. And in fact, even the Big Five did a very beautiful kind of harmonious blenders project, which was very, very unique, and I would never have seen that coming a decade ago. So that's one thing that makes Japanese whiskey different. The second thing is, as a result of this And there's also a result of this culture of bringing Scottish and Canadian and American whiskey into Japan and blending it into the blends that exist here. In a way, the master blender is a much more vaunted figure in a Japanese distillery than the master distiller. So these blends, Japan is really, until recently, again, more famous for its blends. And that's one reason why, if there's one Japanese whiskey that people know, it will be Hibiki, which at the start of this conversation I mentioned is a blend of Yamazaki, Hakshu, and Chita. And I would say, to finish up on this question, if you look at the current trends, some of the newer distilleries, for example, Kanosuke, who are really the face of, new wave Japanese craft distillery. So just to give you some context, we've basically gone from roughly 10 distilleries in 2014 to 124 registered whiskey licenses in 2024. That's incredible growth. And the first wave of these distilleries we saw in the middle of the last decade, Kanosuke, Shizuoka, Asaka, Akeshi, Nagahama, Saburomaru, these guys. So Kanosuke, for example, age a lot of their whiskey in recharred shochu casks. And shochu is Japan's indigenous spirit. Japan is also not bound by the Scottish rules, which demand that the barrel is exclusively made of oak. So they can do things. Ulrike, I'll ask you, what is Japan's most famous tree?
Hinoki.
So you are seeing some aging in hinoki casks. You are seeing some aging in sugi casks,
and the pine tree, right? The matsu.
You're seeing aging also in cherry blossom casks.
Okay.
So the fact that we're not bound legally by a one-to-one interpretation of what Scotland does allows us more flexibility, and so we're seeing some of the new producers doing some what we call cask innovation and kind of trying to bring a more uniquely Japanese twist. I could go on, but we want
to leave time for beer in the back alleys. But we have one more question from the audience, which is: are the tariffs going to affect any of this?
Yes, I mean, you're going to see companies rebalancing their portfolios and rebalancing their exports to the US. Especially now, because obviously we are in an economic downturn. Whiskey is a luxury commodity, and the pricing of Japanese whiskey overseas is already pushing, I think, the absolute upper limits of what a consumer could stomach. So having to then slap on an extra percentage to cover tariffs is going to be problematic for them. So you're going to see, and you've already seen some of the CEOs talk about this, that they're going to have to rebalance, where they put their focus on in terms of their international portfolios.
So maybe let's move on to beer. I mean, it's like basically the same players. The history, of course, goes there were a bunch of players. Maybe Kirin found its technology somewhere on the Liaotung Peninsula in World War I, found a German brewery or something. And then for many years, all we had in Japan was some version of Pilsner. Excellent versions of Pilsner, I hasten to say, and that had something to do with the way the Ministry of Finance had set up the taxation and the stores and where you could buy it. And then there was a craft beer explosion. Where does that stand? Are we back to basically drinking mostly Pilsner, or what's the dynamic of that industry?
Sure. That's really fascinating, and it also allows us to talk about the two of the next big drinks conglomerates, which is Asahi and Kirin. Okay, now Kirin was the big player in the beer scene for a long time in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the early 80s, with as much as over 60% market share, and Asahi almost going bankrupt. And then in 1984, they decided to have a final roll of the dice. So they undertook research. They interviewed 4,000 young people in Tokyo and Osaka and discovered that actually what they wanted was a lighter beer that paired well with food and had a kire. Kire is a word that's used often in sake to describe a short, sharp finish. Asahi brought out a beer called kire koku. Koku refers to the body of the beer. That sold very well. And then, but was only intended to be a limited project. And then they basically doubled down. And in March 1987, released Asahi Super Dry, which took 10 years to then become Japan's biggest selling beer. And as many people know, is Japan's biggest selling beer overseas. And it's an incredible story. I'm going to make a video about it one day. We could spend the whole time just talking about that, because there's so many lessons about Japan that can be uncovered in that. For example, sorry, Ulrika, just one thing I want to say that's really fascinating. What had happened prior in the beer industry is companies had copied each other. And often these were just novelty things. As you say, they were just making the same Pilsner. We had the space age, the 1969 moon landing, the whole space boom. Companies would release like spaceship shaped cans, and then another company would release a spaceship shaped can until that competitive advantage was competed away. The media attacked the other companies. So first of all, Kirin thought that this dry thing was total nonsense. They ignored it for a year. It took the other companies 1 year to bring out another dry beer. And then the media started going after them. I'm not sure if it's of their own volition or if they were paid a little bit by a now slightly wealthier Asahi. But the media started attacking these companies for copying Asahi. And so they all had to withdraw their dry products. And Asahi had this clear runway to becoming, Japan's #1 beer. An absolutely fascinating story.
Well, I wanted to add like 3 tidbits. One was that Kirin then introduced Ichiban Shibori, and Sting made the commercial for that. Let's get together. I remember that, it kind of comes down a Japanese staircase. But more importantly, the turnaround was actually, I taught that turnaround as a main bank case in the old days, because the main bank of Asahi was Sumitomo Bank. And
That's
they
right.
sent in a banker who didn't care about beer. And that's why he could do this. He went in and I said, young guys, you tell me what kind of beer would sell. And so they came up with a completely new, I'm not sure whether that's completely new taste, but whatever, a different kind of beer. And then the end is history. So sometimes you just have to, bring in an outsider into the business, I guess, to do that. So how did the craft beer was partially, if I recall it correctly, a matter of deregulation of the industry, that you didn't have to have these like scale, you could do on a smaller scale, and then as long as you paid the taxes, you'd be okay.
1994 was a key year. So actually, Japan back in the late 1800s had many, many beer breweries. And then you saw this big consolidation in the early 1900s. And then, a lot of laws in a lot of countries are written by the corporates. Let's just leave it at that. And so these big players pressured the government to introduce the most incredibly onerous limits. Like, you could only distribute beer nationally if you had an insane amount of scale. And that basically drove all of these smaller breweries out of business back in the early 1900s. They either got consolidated into these conglomerates, or they just went bust. So fast forward to 1994, that was the first level of deregulation that allowed some of these small, craft breweries to emerge. But even back then, a lot of the breweries were more jibiru, meaning local beer. So they were more in the souvenir beer category. As we know, Japan has an incredible omiyage culture, far exceeding anywhere else I've experienced on Earth, and I've been to 109 countries. And so, it's an easy present to buy the liquid made in the place that you're visiting. Anyway, then obviously we've had the global craft beer boom over the last 2 decades, and further deregulation has allowed a number of craft breweries to spread around Japan. And you've seen the big players react in two ways. One is that they've made acquisitions. So they've made acquisitions domestically. So, for example, Yona, which was one of the first craft beer breweries, was acquired by Kirin, and using that capital, they've been able to set up Yona tap rooms around the country. You've also seen the development of what's known as crafty beer. So, it's still Kirin, but it's rebranded somewhat. So it's still big corporation beer, but looks more like a craft beer. And then you've also seen the beer companies making overseas acquisitions as well. So Asahi is really now a global beer conglomerate. They bought Meantime in London, they bought Fuller's in London, they've made acquisitions around the world, which has really turned them into a huge global player, both in mainstream beer, but also craft beer as well.
San Diego is a big microbrewery town. And in fact, two of our biggest microbreweries were bought by Japanese beer companies. So we know that firsthand here. Let's go maybe to the sake, because I think a lot of people are interested in sake, and kind of plays back to the Japanese soft power and sake is currently in. Is the sake industry fundamentally different? So we know that the beer guys are these big four, and then we have maybe some craft guys, and maybe not doing so well right now, I don't know. But in the sake area, is there a similar industry structure of large players, or is it all sort of the local guys?
Okay, excellent question. So with sake, or Nihonshu, or sake, I think we'll be interchanging between the three. We have over 1,300 breweries who are registered members of the JSS, the Japan Sake and Shochu Makers Association. Okay, over 1,300. Not all of them producing, though. Some of them are either dormant, historic legacy businesses where the real estate that the brewery sits on is so valuable, and the next generation are trying to figure out how best to sell it off. Or there are many motivations why some of these things are dormant, and some of them white label. So they get liquid and they'll put their brand on it, but they're not actually producing liquid themselves. But the majority, of course, are producing. We did unfortunately lose around 100 during the pandemic, which gives you a sign that the industry is overall struggling. I mean, domestically, sake sales have been in decline for some time now. Thankfully, overseas sales are growing, not yet at the level to offset the domestic decline, but nonetheless, our exports to America, our exports to Hong Kong and China, and our exports to Southeast Asia and Australia are the big hope, as well as Europe, of course, in terms of the future growth of the industry.
Do they have a similar challenge about like the whiskey, that there are fake sakes floating around the supermarkets? Not yet. Okay.
Thankfully not. I mean, one thing I will say is that there are now people overseas who produce sake. There's an absolutely fantastic brewery in London, Kanpai, London, who produce exceptional sake. I've got a bottle on my shelves. There it is, just up here. I'm a big fan of also Brooklyn Kura and the great work that Brandon and his team are doing in Brooklyn, New York, over there. So there are a number of people making sake. That makes me very happy because, export sake prices, when I see what they are in the US or the UK, that makes my heart kind of bleed a little bit. And certainly makes your wallets bleed. And I think one of the good gateways into sake is actually, first of all, trying these domestic producers. So people, like Origami Sake in Arkansas. And then from there, you then kind of, move up to exploring what Japanese sake is on your shelves.
I think that is excellent. Yeah. That's an excellent idea, because usually what people do is they start with get cake on or something, and then they kind of go, "Oh, this is not good," and then do the local ones. That's good.
Yeah, it's definitely a drink that suffered a bit. I think, luckily cold chain distribution around the world has improved dramatically, just even in the last decade. So my sense is that a lot of the sake that was leaving this country, 20 or 30 years ago, was not of the highest quality. And when it was reaching its destination, it wasn't it was of an even lower quality. So luckily things have changed, and now we're even able to export Nama, unpasteurized sake. And so, people in the US can drink the absolute freshest sake that we have here, which is fantastic. I would like to touch on something you said, because I think it's a really fascinating point. You tried to wrap up sake with this sort of rise of Japan's soft power. And I actually find it quite fascinating that where Japanese whiskey has really done this, and Japanese food as well, right? Ramen and sushi. I was in London over Christmas and New Year, and the lines that I saw, when I would see a line, I'd be like, oh, what is that for? Is that a line for a fish and chip shop? Is it a line for a pie shop? It was a line for a ramen shop. Absolutely incredible. It is actually surprising to me that sake and shokshu, a big shout out to all the people who are putting in a lot of effort to try to grow that market overseas, they haven't really been swept up with the big boom that we've had in Japanese food and drink and general Japanese soft power. And that's interesting to me. And I continually wonder why and how we can fix that.
Well, I think we have reached a point where every Michelin star restaurant in the United States has some yuzu flavored dish, right? And so it'll happen. You just hang in there. It'll happen. So we're talking about the little guys. I remember vividly. This is many years ago. The place no longer exists, but the Nihonshu Kyokai, the Japan Sake Association, had a restaurant in Kasumigaseki, of all places. Actually, they had the headquarters, the association building, and in the bottom, the bottom of that building was a restaurant. And so they had sake from all kinds of regions, and it was just really amazing how many regional differences there are. Actually, I think too much. It's really difficult to be a sake connoisseur because there's so many different sake brands. How do you know? And then they do it by Karaguchi or whatever it is, but even that I don't quite understand. So can you give us a sort of the easy guide to how to order sake in a restaurant kind of thing, if that exists, if there are like 100 bottles?
Yeah, I don't know if you just saw my sigh. I do want to touch on what you've said, and then I'll give you what I can in the time that we have. Okay, to help you.
Yeah, because we also want to go to the little bars, right? We want to go to the little bar where Mama-san has just 3 bottles. Right?
I lead drinks tours around Tokyo, and I host sake tastings and I host whiskey tastings, and it's a question I get a lot from people who have tried exploring sake in their home countries, and it's tough to understand. First of all, the branding of it is very difficult, right? To a lot of people, even people who read Japanese, it's just 2 or 3 kanji written often in the, what to a calligraphy master is obviously completely different, but to the untrained eye look very similar labels. And it's very difficult to understand the pertinent information. And the thing that is problematic is actually there's a saying here about, that the biggest factor in affecting the taste of a sake is how it's made, and how it's made is a complicated process. How many hours did we work in the koji muro to produce the kojified rice, which will then go into the fermentation tank? How long was the fermentation? What type of yeast was it? Was it 9 or was it 901, which is a non-foaming variant of it? All of these things play into the ultimate taste of the sake. And then, of course, thank you, National Tax Agency. The way that the legal words that can be put on a bottle of sake are all to do with the rice polishing ratio, okay, which is one factor that does affect the taste of a sake. So do you know what I mean by the rice polishing ratio?
Yeah, 23 or 50 or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, I'm glad to see tennership is going well, because 23 is typically a lot more expensive, than for example, the higher numbers. But yes, an untouched grain of rice, we call that 100%. If there's none left, that's 0%. And, the grain of rice in the middle has a starch. That's what we want. We want the koji to attach the starch. So starch plus koji gives us sugar, and then sugar plus yeast gives us alcohol and carbon dioxide. But on the outside of that are lipids and proteins. They can produce some off flavors in sake production. So typically that sake is polished down. By the way, when you go below 50%, the word that's used is daiginjo. Now, time is money. I'm sure anybody at a business school knows that. And therefore, we have to charge you guys more money simply because of the rice making, simply because of the rice polishing that's taking place. The sake making itself may stay completely the same, but if we use exactly the same process, but with rice that's been polished to a lower percentage, then we need to charge you more money for that. And that is typically why a lot of the sake that's exported is daiginjo. Okay, so that sake, daiginjo, is going to typically be fruitier. Okay, you're going to get this kind of lychee, strawberry, apple notes. These are because of the esters that come out, ethyl caproate and isoamyl acetate. Banana, sometimes, it's a bubble gum like aromas. And so you get this much fruitier sake. So that's your clue number one, Ulrike, okay? The lower the polishing ratio, the closer that you're going to get to these fruity flavors, okay? And another word to look for is junmai. Now, annoyingly, junmai translates as pure rice. And I say annoyingly because it's led to this belief amongst people who only drink the, Grand Cru organic wine, that junmai is the equivalent of organic. It's not. One of the tools available to brewers is to add a small amount of brewer's alcohol into their production, which actually helps amplify and enhance the flavor. And that is called ariten, but you don't see the word ariten on the bottle. When a brewer hasn't done that, they put the word junmai on it. And so that junmai, if you compared the same sake, but one was ariten and one was junmai, the junmai may be, on the whole, like a little bit more understated and kind of a little bit more subtle. So circling back to the polishing ratio, ginjo refers to 60 to 50%, and that's where you start to get this ginjo ka, which is this ginjo aroma that I just described, fruitiness, but a daiginjo is going to be more fruity. And then some people like me are big fans of hongjozo. That's also good for your wallet. That's where the rice polishing ratio is between 70 to 60%. And with hongjozos, you typically get, maltier, bolder, sometimes can manifest itself as a little bit more caramel, certainly a lot more of that steamed rice aroma, sort of real sake. And I'm a big fan of hongjozo. So hopefully that's, in the time that we have, that's given you a small
it's fabulous. So I mean, the labels are really, I've kind of often go with a label and the some of these categories, but that's really great. So when we go to a back alley drinking place, and I want to actually ask you about, there's a mama-san there, often, it can be a guy, and they carry sake and they claim it's like the best, and and the label looks nice, and so they bring all the food and whatnot. What is the economics of those bars? I mean, sort of these tiny little back alley places, because I'm kind of looking at that and I think, okay, we sat here for 3 hours, you're charging us this, and you did not make enough money to be it worth your while to dine, right? So what is driving that fabulous back alley bar scene?
We are so lucky in this country, and especially in Tokyo, to have so many of these tiny bars. And I can tell you, it's one of these things where grammatically correct sentences will hopefully come out of my mouth. Now, I can tell you academically that on a like-for-like basis, the rent of these places is going to be lower than, for example, the equivalent real estate in London or New York. That a lot of these places have rent structures which have been grandfathered in or grandmothered in, as it were, that they, that therefore they are locked into much, much lower rent. So, the rent for a lot of these is not going to be the reason why they go out of business unless they truly, do nothing. I can tell you, for example, Ulrika, that you may swan in, for example, one night, on your visit here. But as somebody who lives here, there are a few bars that I do frequent regularly. And it's always nice that I'm not the only regular at these bars. I will go there and there will be other regulars. And you start to understand that I think these bars have a loyal customer base in the same way that the local pub does in the UK, right? That people, they've chosen that this place is going to be, our whiskey bar, our cocktail bar, our, snack bar. And they actually go there much more regularly than you might expect. You may also have heard of the bottle keep system. The bottle keep system is a genius way of locking in revenue up front. So, you pay, it's brilliant. For those of you not familiar with it, you go, you basically pay for the bottle up front. And nominally, then all your pours from that bottle are free. Well, I mean, free because you paid for it. But you pay for example, soda. So I have several bottle keeps around the city with my name on of whiskey and shochu. And it's typically spirits because spirits obviously keep longer. And when I turn up, I pay the cover charge. And then I also pay for soda. So if I want to drink highballs, I have to keep the soda coming. Some bars even will charge for ice, but it's just a way, to just, get the revenue from people. But it's a genius way. So all of these, they're ways of generating revenue, and it's an understanding of the economics, which perhaps is not obvious to people. But nonetheless, it's still amazing to me, like from a reality perspective, that we just have the most incredible bars in the most incredible locations. And by the way, that they're typically on the upper floors of buildings. And that also means that the real estate is going to be lower. If you're in some old crumbling building, in Monzen Nakacho, then your rent is obviously going to be very different from being on the ground floor in Ginza.
So we have another question on these bars. It's my colleague Josh, actually, who's clearly into this, and he's wondering whether the Japanese soft power that is now going around the globe actually it seems to include listening bars that having a moment that's mostly about music, but he has seen highball machines in surprising places. What is that all about?
Sure. Well, the highball has a very special place in Japanese culture, not just because it's the way that most whiskey is consumed within Japan, but also because after 25 years of declining consumption of whiskey in Japan from 1983, 2008 was the turnaround, and it was driven by Suntory having this absolutely incredible, truly, you should be studying this as a case study if you haven't already, Ulrika. The Kakubin driven highball boom that Suntory single-handedly created, that single-handedly turned around domestic whiskey consumption in Japan. Absolutely incredible story. And now they're trying to export that culture along with Japan's soft power, people overseas wanting to be like us here. And so Suntory have a nominally export-only blend called Toki. You can think of it as a kind of cut price hibiki. And so there's a lot of Toki machines around the US. Actually, Kakubin, which I mentioned. So Kakubin is that bottle that comes in that tortoise shell with a yellow label in Japan, first created in 1937. It's their flagship highball whiskey domestically and is now JSLMA compliant. That very subtly under the radar, they made it real Japanese whiskey, which it wasn't before. So that means that they can now export it in good conscience. and you're seeing a lot of kakabin starting to appear overseas as well. I think the rise of listening bars is interesting because, if you think about what they are, you just go in and you're not meant to talk to anyone. You're not meant to talk to your friends. You're just meant to go in and listen to these records on these ultra high-end speakers and audio file systems. And it is really fascinating to me that is something that is being emulated in New York and LA and in other parts of the world.
Yeah, it clearly. So, unbelievably, we're kind of approaching the end of our hour, but I have two questions from the audience that I thought well, actually, we have three questions. The first is a business question, and the other two are about hangovers. So, the business question is why the sake industry in Japan is so fragmented and not dominated more by large players. Is there an economies of scale thing? And I'll ask my other two, and then you can put the weight on it as you like, which is, what is your favorite Japanese whiskey that is somewhat accessible outside of Japan? And Tom wants to know, what are your recommendations for an easily accessible Japanese cure for bad whiskey hangover?
Okay, all excellent questions, both practical and theoretical. Let's take it from the top with the sake industry. So yes, we're obviously a lot to talk about. So we didn't talk about the fact that 80% of the sake sold in Japan does come from it's tough to get exact numbers on this, but somewhere between the top 10 and the top 20. So we do have big players in the sake world, and so there is. You see that's interesting. So it's not so much that there's been consolidation, but that these guys have become the de facto producers of sake. Their distribution nationally. Their distribution nationally has been a lot better. You see, a lot of these 1,300 that I mentioned earlier, even to this day, will really produce sake for their very, very parochial area. I visited a brewery that I've been to several times in Rikuzen Takata, which is one of the areas that was heavily affected by the devastating tsunami, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake. And I asked them, I said, so how's sales going? And they're very, very good. We service the local area, the local restaurants, and they have, maybe one or two places in Tokyo that carry what they do. So these guys are ticking alive, and they're atrophying slowly, right? They're one by one. They are kind of going bankrupt almost by sort of natural causes. And like I said, the NTA, I think deep down wants to accelerate that consolidation. So yes, there are big players, and there are certainly economies of scale. Sake brewing is historically seasonal. So the 1st of October marks the start of the sake brewing. Sake brewing involves heating things up. And historically, until the late 1800s, it was far easier for human beings to heat things up than cool things down. Okay, that explains a lot of human seasonal production across a number of food and drink stuffs. And the 1st of October is the start of the sake brewing season. And that still takes place at these traditional breweries. But these mega breweries, they have climate controlled, massive, factories, breweries making the drink. So that's where the economy of scale can come in, that you can run this thing year round and at a much larger scale than you can a smaller brewery. So that's question number one. Question number two was I have the hangover one in my mind. But
the first one is your favorite.
My favorite somewhat accessible Japanese whiskey. Okay, so there is a video I put out. I was challenged. When you're part of the Whiskey Tube drinks community, then you get challenged by fellow whiskey tubers. And I was challenged to pick one distillery for life. And spoiler alert, that was Hakushu. So if you ask me to pick a bottle from the older distilleries, it would be probably the Hakushu 12, which is actually far, far easier to get in the US than it is in Japan. I just absolutely Love that whiskey. I don't like leaning into the marketing of these guys, but they have engineered this product to literally be the taste of a forest. The Haksha distillery has an altitude over 700 meters, in Mount Kaikomagataka, surrounded by beautiful forests. My favorite mineral water, Suntory Tenensui from the Minami Alps, is the water that's used to make Hakshu. And it's delightful, lightly peated, real complexity, but also very easy drinking dram. If you want something newer, I'm going to go back to the distillery who I mentioned earlier, Kanosuke, and they have a core range which is now available in the UK. It's available in the US, and Hioki is their grain whiskey distillery. It's where they make their shochu, but they're making grain whiskey there. Kind of this interesting kind of mix almost of Irish tradition, Canadian tradition, and Japanese tradition all mixed together. And their Hioki pot still is absolutely worth checking out.
And the hangover.
The hangover. Okay, well, this is where we finally got to revealing my real secrets, right? So I use a couple of things. One is obviously, maybe many people have heard of ukon no chikara, which is a substance sold in a gold can that salarymen swear by. But I have done my research, and basically, you want ginger and turmeric as the kind of two substances that you want to target. So I've done my research, and Matsumoto Kiyoshi sells these basically digestive aids, but I don't use them for that. I use them because they have the very high percentages, the highest I've found of those two substances. So that's one. The other one, again, many people have heard of Pocari Sweat. Pocari Sweat is Japan's iconic electrolyte drink created by Otsuka, mirroring the composition of sweat, but with reducing the salt content, upping the sugar content, and adding a bit of citrus flavoring for good measure. But there is a kind of level 2, a level up Pocari Sweat, which is called OS1. And OS1 is much closer to the composition of sweat, and it is devastatingly good electrolyte drink. I swear by that so much that when I go overseas, you can actually get it in powdered form. And so I take OS1 powder with me, which you can order direct from the company, so that I'm OS1'd up. And typically what I do is, so they sell them in 500ml bottles, and I will drink half a bottle before I go to bed, and then half a bottle when I wake up the next morning.
I think there are lots of people in the audience that wish they'd asked you this question 20 years ago, but here we are. So unfortunately, time is up. Wow, I could go for another hour. There are so many things that I want to know that we didn't get covered. And my guess is that the audience, or many in the audience, have the same feeling, because we're not losing anybody. You have them at the edges of their seats. So Mac, maybe we have to bring you back sometime and continue this conversation. This was great. Or everybody, if and when you want to go to Tokyo or are in Tokyo, look up Mac on Maction Planet and Kanpai Planet. And I'm sure you'll learn a lot. And of course, he's also got his bespoke tours, which I think I want to just hire you on or find you a bottle, keep places. So thank you very much, Mac. Audience, thanks for joining us today. And we'll be back in about 4 weeks with Jim Ramo, the sociologist, who will talk about changing family dynamics, which actually probably is connected to what we're talking about here. We had a number of questions about special drinks for women, the role of women in Japanese society and so forth and so on. So it's all coming together. We'll have more opportunity to talk. Thank you, Mac. Thank you for joining us.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, Ulrika, and thank you to the audience for joining us today. I look forward to coming back. I'd be privileged. I'd be very happy to.
Let's do that. Okay, goodbye.